Luke Soares, using crying to tell an old man story.
On this day, I was maybe 6 or 7, and this was a day that I cried and cried and cried. My mission that day was to walk from my grandmother's house to my elementary school in the morning. Now, this is about 12 blocks, and it was a straight shot. I'm the oldest of the grandkids, so I was always a little bit more protected because I was the first. And so when you're the first, they kind of look at you different. If you're the third, fourth, fifth, 20th, forget about it. Being the first, I was under the radar all the time. I left my grandmother's house early that morning, just like a typical morning, and halfway through reaching school, I noticed that one of the neighbors had their gates wide open. They had a big house with a big front yard, but they also had a big German Shepherd. Now, when you're this big and you see a big dog roaming around the yard freely as he pleases, and that dog looks at you and sees you as his next meal, it freaks you out. It sure freaked me out. And I turned and I ran and I ran and I ran until I reached a point where I looked back and it looked like he was about to chomp on my heels. I looked and I saw this porch. And so I thought, there's my escape. I'm going to run up to this porch and I'm going to bang on the door to plead for somebody to save me, because this dog is going to eat me alive. That dog, very clever, saw me banging on the door, and as I reached the perimeter of that porch, he put on the brakes and he would not step any further. He saw that I was in the protective zone. So he waited, and then after a few minutes, he turned around and walked right back to his own yard. Now I was in a safe area, and I was thinking, how am I going to get past this dog who's loose out on the street? I'm never going to get past through that house without being eaten alive by this dog. So I decided my house was just a few houses down. I was going to take my lunchbox and I'm just going to sit and play in the backyard. Well, that didn't sit well because the school called my grandmother. And my grandmother, being protective of her oldest grandson, was on a mission to find out what happened. And she came and she looked all over the area. She went to my house and she looked under a pail that was flipped over and saw my lunchbox. Then she started patrolling the yard, and finally she found me. Well, she wasn't very pleased. And she's never hit me before, but that day she was like on me until I learned my lesson. Never at school. And that day I cried. First I cried because the dog was going to eat me alive. Then I cried because I got a well-deserved spanking. But then I cried because I didn't want to upset my grandmother. And then I cried because my parents found out about it and I got more punishment. That's the day that I remember I cried and cried and cried. Thank you.
Luke Soares showing how crying clears the soul. Returning home, Omen Stories.